Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to be looking at how do we graph our information from our measurement at home experiment into Excel. Alright, so let's just walk through this. Our lab experiment told us that we needed to use spreadsheet software such as MS Excel, Microsoft Excel, to prepare a scatter plot, that's a specific type of graph, of our average measured circumference versus our averaged measured diameter for all of our objects. Now when we're talking about something versus something else, that's always saying y versus x. So that means we're saying we want to have our diameter as x-axis, and that's our independent variable, and then our circumference on the y-axis. We also want to make this a little bit more complicated because we want to show our calculated circumferences on the exact same graph. And so our instructions told us that we need to set up our Excel spreadsheet to look like this. So we have column A as our object labels, column is our measured diameters, our X values, column C is our first set of Y values, our measured circumferences, and column D is our calculated circumferences. Alright, so if I go ahead and set this up, I'm just going to copy over what I have in my little table example down at the bottom. So column B, the first row, should say measured diameters. Column C, the first row, should say measured circumference. Put in my units in parentheses. And then my last column, column D, should say calculated circumference. And that's also in centimeters. Now notice that all of my squares kind of bleed into each other. So if I want it to look nice and neat and organized like the example in our lab instructions, we want to make sure that we highlight these cells. So that is left clicking and dragging across. And then we can fix the format if we come up here to where it says little A, B, and then arrow down to C. This is our wrap text button. If we click on that, that's going to automatically adjust this so that way our text fits within our cell. Alright, and I want to make sure I put in my object labels for my column A. Now my objects that I chose, that I could find around my house, were a 15-ounce can of beans, a pen holder, and chapstick. So these were the cylindrical objects I found. So 15-ounce can of beans, a pen holder, and a tube of chapstick. Alright, now I'm going to do the same things we did to adjust the format. I'm going to highlight all of my cells. So each little square here is a cell. And remember that's left click and drag down. Come up here to our wrap text button. I click that once and boom, auto format. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to copy over my data. So I figured out that I measured that my diameter of my can of beans was 7.25 centimeters. And I don't have to type centimeters into my little box here. And if I do, that's actually going to make it really problematic for me to graph. I want to make sure that I keep my cells with the numbers to be numbers only. The measured circumference for my can of beans is 23.38, and my calculated circumference for my can of beans I calculated to be 22.8. Notice that it doesn't have the same number of significant figures as my measured circumference. My measured circumference has 2 decimal places based on the ruler that I used. However, my calculated circumference, because I was using my measured diameter, and the formula circumference equals pi times the diameter, that meant that I had to use my same significant figures as I had in my initial diameter measurement, which is only 3. So I only get 1 decimal place for my calculated circumference. Alright, so I come down to my pen holder, and I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm just transferring data over. So it's 3.49 is my measured diameter, 12.31 is 3.1 is my measured circumference, and then 11.0 is my calculated circumference. Now, if your 0 disappears there, want to show it as being the correct significant figures for your measurement, with that cell highlighted, you can come up here to these little zeros to the left and zeros to the right, and you can change the number of zeros that we have showing, or at least actually more generically, the number of decimal places we have showing. For this, same as above, I only want to have one decimal place showing because I should only have 3 total significant figures for my calculated circumference because it comes from my measured diameter. Alright, let's come down here to my chapstick and get those values put in. 1.52 is my measured diameter, 5.01 is my measured circumference, and 4.78 is my calculated circumference. So I want to go through and create my graph. It says I want to use a scatter plot. Now my graphs are found in the Insert section of my menu. There's a few ways we can go about doing this. If we're lucky, we can just highlight our data and insert and choose the correct graph type. Scatter is this one that's a bunch of random little dots. And if we hover over it, you can see where it says Insert Scatter, XY, or Bubble Chart. We want a scatter plot. And so you can see our options here, scatter, and then it has this little crazy set of dots, and that's the one that we want. Now if we go to do that, notice that that's going to give me 3 different sets of data posted on my graph. But I don't want that. I only want 2 sets of data because I should have one set of x's with y's, that's my measured circumference data, and I should have one set of calculated circumferences with my measured diameters. That's only 2 sets of data. So this isn't going to work out for us. So if that doesn't work, or it gives you some really weird values, that's okay. We can go back and do this manually. So let's walk through how do we do this manually, because that always works. So the same thing as before, only now we're not going to have anything highlighted. We're just going to pick this empty square off in the middle of nowhere. And I'm going to come back to my Insert Scatter, and I want to put in some scatter plots. Now, very exciting, that gives us a big square that has nothing in it. Now this is our graph, it just doesn't have any data yet. So we're going to have to go through and put data in. So you notice when I click on the graph here, that changed all of my ribbons up at the top. So now I have Chart Design and Format, and under Chart Design, I have Select Data. Now I'm going to add data to my graph this way. Now I want to add 2 data series. My first one is going to be my measured circumference. And I can type in my name like that, or I can just click on the cell that says measured circumference. Now my next piece I need to put in is my series X values. So to put in my X values, so I have to select a range. So I click on my arrow up, and that brings me out to this spreadsheet, and I can click on my first X value, and I'm left clicking, and I'm just dragging down to highlight all of the X values that I want to include in my graph. Once I've got them all selected, I come back over to my Edit Series box, and I click that down arrow. Do the same thing for my Y values. I need to select all of the Y values for measured circumference. So I click on the up arrow, come over here, I click on my first Y value, and I just left click, and then I slide down to highlight all of them. And once I've got all of my data selected, I click on the down arrow. And now as I've done that, all of 3 of those data points show up on my graph. And I click OK. So that's the first data series. Now my second data series I want to include is my calculated circumference. So I need to add one more. So I need to add a legend for calculated circumference. So the other way, other than just typing it in, I could just click on where it says calculated circumference. And so you can see here it changes how it's labeled. It says now sheet 1 D1. So that's column D, row 1. So this is cell D1. Now if I make a change in my worksheet, it'll make a change over here in my graph as well, and I won't have to retype it. Alright, so same as before, I want to select my X values, and I want to select the exact same X values that I did before, because all of my calculated circumferences came from my measured diameters. So I want to make sure I'm using the exact same X values. Now I want to choose my Y values, and this time I want to make sure I choose my calculated circumferences. And now I have a set of orange dots on my graph. Click OK. Now to make sure everything stays the same, I'll just click OK again, and now I have a graph. Except, is this a good graph? Am I missing anything? If you were to just look at my graph, could you tell what it was about? Not really. So I need to add a lot of information to this. Now there's a few things that we can do. We can go through and we can add each piece individually. We could also try out these quick layouts. These quick layouts start moving things around, and they don't necessarily help. Depends on what type of thing we're looking for. They might make it look weird. They might be helpful. Like some of those data labels being stacked on top of each other, it's really hard to read. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use this add chart element, and we're going to add all the pieces that we need individually. So the first thing we want to make sure that we have are our axis titles, so that way we know what the X value and the Y values are representing. So we want to add in primary horizontal and primary vertical axis titles. Now to adjust these, we double click, and that's a left click, into the box where it says axis title. And then we can just highlight those words and then replace them with what we want it to be. Now my X value is my diameter, and these are all measured diameters. I want to make sure anytime I'm including a quantity that I include the appropriate unit as well. So I'll put centimeters, that's my unit, and I'll put it in parentheses. So that clearly sets it off as being a unit rather than being part of my axis title descriptor. And I'm going to do the same thing with my y-axis, only now instead of it being measured circumference, this also is representing calculated circumference, so I'm just going to call this circumference. That's also in centimeters. Alright, now I don't need to adjust any more kind of descriptors there. I do need to be able to tell my blue and my orange apart from each other, especially if we're printing this in black and white. It's really hard to tell those two pieces from each other. So one of the things I am going to do is I'm going to double click on this data series, and I want to see if I can find, here we go, over in this paint bucket, I want to change my marker. So right now my marker is a circle. So come up here, click on marker, and then marker options. And so Microsoft has a tendency to default to the circle. I want to be able to tell them apart even if it's in black and white. So I'm going to go to built-in, and I'm going to change the shape. That's the easiest way to tell the difference. And I'm going to turn this into a nice little triangle. So now I have blue circles and orange triangles. Alright, so the other thing I am missing is I am missing a graph title. So I still need to add in one more chart element. I need to put in a chart title. And my chart title should show information about my graph. And it's not just Y versus X, because you can clearly see that from our axes titles. We have each axis is labeled with its circumference or diameter and the unit, so that doesn't really tell me anything, or at least doesn't tell me anything new. So I need to make sure that my graph title is descriptive of the information that I see here. And so I'm going to call this relationship between circumference and diameter for a series of cylindrical objects, because that's what I measured. A can of beans, a pen holder, and chapstick, those were all cylinders. Alright, now the other thing that I'm also missing you might remember from some of your graphs you've made before, and especially important because I have two different data sets, is I should include a legend. So if we come back up here to the chart element, we can come up here and choose legend and wherever we want it to be. My legend can be at the top, my legend could be at the bottom, right, or the left. I kind of like it at the bottom. Makes it a little bit easier to see, and it doesn't interfere with our title, and it doesn't squish my graph in too much either. Now the other bits, now I do have a completed graph. The rest of my analysis though is going to be asking for trend lines. Now there's two ways I can put in trend lines. I can right click on my data and add trend line, or I can select my chart element and I can add trend line that way. Now the type of trend line that we want to add is a linear trend line, but we want to make sure that we also choose more options because we want to be a little bit more detailed with what we're showing. So if we click on this more options, I'm going to drag my screen down just a little bit so we can see all of the pieces. I want to make sure that not just do I have linear selected, but I want to make sure that I am displaying my equation on the chart. The equation popped up, and I am displaying my R-square value. Now, that gets us one set of data. I can go ahead and close that out. And I'm going to put this down because my orange data is kind of below the blue data. So I'm just going to slide this to the bottom right-hand side. I'm going to do the same thing with my blue data. I'm going to select that blue data series if I can. If you're having trouble selecting it, make your graph bigger. That'll make it a little easier to select that other data set. And just as before, I'm going to add in a trend line, and I want it to be linear. Oh, but I forgot to click that more options. That's okay. We can go in and we can use that right click option with that add trend line. Whoops. We right click on the trend line and we can format that trend line. So just as before, linear, and I want to display the equation and display the R-squared value. So notice that it popped up in about the same place as before. That's part of why I dragged that original line information down and off to the right. I bring it over here so that way our two values are not sitting on top of each other. Now our R-square is giving us information about the quality of the fit of our line, so how close each of these dots are to the line of best fit. The closer we are to one, the better the fit is. This is an indication of how good our precision is for our individual measurements. Now considering that the orange data is calculated circumference, this is all coming directly from those measured diameters, the fit is perfect because all of those calculation values align perfectly with the measured values. That's the wonder of the calculation. Now my measured values, that's not quite true. You can see I've got 0.9963, so it's not exactly perfect, but that's okay. Now I do want to make sure that I adjust for my significant figures. I shouldn't have more than 2 decimal places, so I do want to make sure that I'm adjusting this information. If I double click into my box with my text, I should bring up this Format Trendline option. Alright, here we go. These text options. So I want to make sure that I am formatting my text. Label options, sorry. Sometimes can be hard to find. So we want to make sure that we're formatting our type. So category, general. We want to make sure that we're adjusting this for our numbers. So if we can turn this over to number, we can specify a number of decimal places. So 2 decimal places is where we want to be. So that has that line. Notice we changed from a lot of digits here down to just 3.17. We'll do the same for this line. It is 3.144 is our slope currently. We drop down to number and 2 decimal places. It drops down to 3.14. So now I have both equations of my lines. These are in y equals mx plus b form, so slope-intercept form. I've got my R-squared values, and now I have absolutely everything that my report was asking for. So have a great day and do well on your first set of graphs.